Hi everyone, it is the end of a year, and what a year it has been. It seems like 2020 lasted forever, but at the same time skimmed over us somehow. Like many of you, I read a lot during this year, as I do every year. This channel dedicated to books and adaptations, I also read books that are not part of that list. Some of them I'd recommend to y'all. Like last year, there is no set genre as to what I'm recommending here, so if there is something totally not piquing your interest, stick around, you might find something. So here we go. What I read in 2020 that I am recommending to you. Starting off this list with a book that came out this year, Devolution did something I didn't think was possible and made Bigfoot scary. Max Brooks, best known for World War Z and the Zombie Survival Guide, he takes that research-heavy writing style and makes a narrative about a technology-reliant Silicon Valley-type community out in the middle of the forest. Then a natural disaster happens and takes all of that technology convenience away. And then there's some Bigfoots out there. I recommend it, especially if you're someone like me who has lived both in rural and urban communities. And when I mean rural, I mean early in the morning you hear scratching or something outside your house and you turn on the porch light and you just see something big just running back into the shadows, and a couple seconds later all you see are these two glowing eyes staring back at you in the dark. Or you hear like a bobcat screaming and it sounds like a woman screaming. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you're on YouTube. Just look up bobcat screams. It's really crazy, and like someone like me who grew up with that, Max Brooks brought back some memories, is what I'm saying. This is a book, if you are interested in reading and you probably would have read it already, or at least saw the movie. Interview with a Vampire is not some obscure book by any means, following the adventures of Vampire Louis as he is turned and lives his life over the centuries, at first in New Orleans and then across Europe. A mixture of both Victorian Gothic melodrama and, despite not taking place during the time, 1970s nihilism takes place in here too. It is not a happy book. Rice's vampires are not gleeful monsters relishing in their bloodlust, but sexy, sad vampires. The later parts of the novel stuck with me more since the message the characters were going on about were not the horrors of addiction to blood or anything like that, but the horrors of being immortal, or at least surviving while everyone around you are aged out or dying. You're living forever, and you're not really liking the people you're living forever with. It is a bleak novel, not about the fear of death, but the fear of living. Obviously, Rice wasn't thinking about isolation during the pandemic, but there is a type of connection I think many people can get from Louis while we sit in our houses away from our loved ones, being in a kind of living death ourselves. Bitter Karella hosts a YouTube channel talking about horror writers as well as running a popular Twitter account called the Midnight Society, played in the same way as the show Are You Afraid of the Dark? Karella imagines versions of famous horror authors. The original lineup was Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, Charles Barker, and Dean Koontz. The joke is that these authors are exaggerated versions of what they are famous for writing. Poe is the gothic big brother, Barker is the sarcastic horny one, King likes rock and roll and muscle cars, Koontz is like a little brother, and Lovecraft is a lanky, awkward nerd. The roster quickly bloomed, with Mary Shelley being the too cool goth queen to hang out with them, for example, and among many others. Midnight Pals is not just a collection of the tweets from this account, but there's also artwork and short stories written by Karella that are themselves parodies of the works of the authors that they're spoofing. It comes from a deep place of love for horror writers and the horror genre, and I think any horror fan would love this. Evan Dorkin is a comic book writer that's been in the industry going on 3 decades now. In those years, he's noticed a certain branch of very loud, very opinionated, and very possessive demographic of nerddom. This series is about that. Inspired to make this series after a friend of his received numerous death threats for a decision he made in a superhero line, the Eltingville Club is everything us nerds like to do. Watch Twilight Zone marathons, talk about stupid minor details of obscure pieces of pop culture, obsessing over some figurine of some movie or other, but shows its ugly side. This series is funny, but it's something that you can't read in one sitting. Each issue is just a takedown, shove-in-your-face look at a toxic side of geekdom. And unfortunately, I think the ones that should read it are the ones that won't. Taking place in the 90s and early 2000s, the Eltingville Club may be dated in its references, but its message is still pretty modern. Not every book here is depressing and bleak. This one is about whales. Lots and lots of facts about whales. I read this for research for my Orca video, and none of it went into the video. Nick Pyenson, he starts in the past with these animals when they were land mammals, going over the fossil records, and then later on we talk about his own personal adventures in studying these animals today. You learn a lot about whales is what I'm saying. Nick's writing isn't boring, he kept my interest. If you're into marine biology or paleontology and want to read something besides dinosaurs, I'd recommend picking this up. You'll have a whale of a time. Earlier this year, YouTuber Lindsay Ellis published her novel Axiom's End, and it ended up on the New York Times bestseller list. This is not that book. Awoken is Ellis and her friends, YouTubers Alyssa Hansen, Antonella, and Serra. Don't know if I'm saying that right. Along with 5 other ghostwriters, 8 years ago, coming together and writing a paranormal young adult romance novel in the Cthulhu mythos. This book is not so much a parody as it is more of like kind of a self-aware, tongue-in-cheek trip between 2 different types of the fantasy genre that don't go together at all, and yet it works. The people that would best enjoy the story would be those that are familiar with the tropes of these 2 different worlds. Under authors whom are too in on the joke, this would have ended up a disaster, but that's not the case here. The best moments in the novel is where the 2 come together, in which Lovecraft's signature overdramatic style of writing about these feelings that he just can't describe, and if he could describe them, he'd go insane, is instead a fear. In this book, it's teenage romance. I mean, that's very clever, because as a teenager, can you really explain those feelings you had on your crush? I mean, I know I couldn't. I wish Alice the best of luck along with all of her friends, but I think this is also a fun little read to check out. Another book that many people probably read, this time because they were forced to in school. Not me, but my first video on this channel was a Steinbeck novel, and this is one of his much shorter novels than Grapes of Wrath. Following 2 ranch hands in the American Midwest during the Great Depression, George and Lenny find themselves going from place to place, saving what little money they can to get a place of their own, only for that dream to be shot down. Steinbeck became famous for his stories on the issues of migrant workers during the Great Depression, and this one is no different. I recommend this one for its length. It won't take long, and the relationship between Lenny and George, 2 people that have nothing but try still to get something, driving for that American dream when the American dream was a nightmare for many people. That being said, the treatment of the only female character in the book as a plot device without even really giving her a name will turn off some readers. It is a weak point for the story, but I think it's still a strong story nonetheless. If you've never read it or haven't picked it up since school, I recommend picking it up now. It won't take long to read it. I feel like I'm turning into a dad without actually having kids, because I started getting really interested in World War II this year. When Books Went to War is a book about books. The author, Molly Manning, focuses on the Armed Services edition of Paperbacks specifically made for soldiers fighting in the war. And I was enjoying this book so much, I actually asked my sisters to get me one of these editions that are still around. This is an old copy of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The cover's ripped off, the pages are missing, and they're super brittle, but that's what you expect because it was made on the cheap side so you can make so much. And it's almost 80 years old now. To fill up this book, Molly Manning fills the pages with testimonies and letters from soldiers discovering the joy of reading that they didn't have back home, along with explanations that this program made books like A Tree Grows in Brooklyn and The Great Gatsby into classics. Yeah, this program that was made is pretty much the reason why American high school students need to read The Great Gatsby. There's also a great chapter on how this program accidentally got entangled into a law that was being pushed that would have prevented millions of people from being able to vote by mail in 1944. You probably won't find a more wholesome book on the horrors of war, though, and speaking of the horrors of war, There are a lot of books and think pieces made about World War I, how it was the beginning of the dismantling of the current way of thinking, not just of war, but honor, glory, patriotism. There was a sense of loss of innocence, in a way, and it inspired new types of horror. Author W. Scott Poole goes through film, art, and poetry to paint a picture of veterans of the Great War returning to their homes and coping with the horrors of what they saw in their works, including quotes from these works or written testimonies some of these figures made of their experiences. That being said, since Poole's last book was an H.P. Lovecraft biography, he made plenty of pages dedicated to the man, even though he never served. It's a good in-depth look at the foundations of the horror genre that was built on what we have today. I imagine it's kind of hard to write a biography on Mary Shelley. The part that she's known for and the most lasting part of her legacy occurred when she was just 18, and there's literally an entire lifetime to go through after that. It's pretty much the highlight, at least the highlight that most people interested in Shelley would want to read. This book is no exception to that, with most of it dedicated to Mary's parents, whom are interesting in their own right, Mary's upbringing, and a look into the world of Georgian London. Unlike spying on whales, I actually got to use some info in this book for my Frankenstein videos. Mary Shelley's life has taken on a type of mysticism in its own right, and I recommend this to anyone that wants to know the person behind the legend. Neil Gaiman is basically a powerhouse of an author at this point. Coraline, American Gods, Doctor Who, and The Sandman, a horror fantasy series taking place in the DC comic book universe. The Sandman series follows Morpheus, the Lord of Dreams, at first imprisoned in the early 1910s and finally escaping in the 1980s. Morpheus finds himself in a world filled with costume superheroes and his realm of dreams in complete disarray, with cameos by Martian Manhunter and the Scarecrow, along with Justice League villains like Dr. Destiny. Think of him like DC's answer to Freddy Krueger, as well as the whole pantheon of mythical and religious figures. Morpheus tries to set things right in the realm and bring balance back to the world of dreams. Audible produced this year an audio drama of the first 3 volumes of the series. When I mean drama, I mean an all-star cast for the parts, Gaiman narrating, and plenty of sound effects and music in place for this 10-hour piece. The audio drama is so close to the original comic that you could have the book with you and listen to it, and it'll flow through nicely. That being said, you have advantages and disadvantages with the change in medium. This is a horror story with violence. Sexual violence, suicide, depression, and animal cruelty in the mix. While it's easier to gloss over those parts in a comic, listening to talented actors and actresses act out the parts, it doesn't make a pleasant morning commute to work, is what I'm saying. On the other side of that, however, a comic is framed, your eyes going from panel to panel, the reader gets to make their own voices and inflections in your head, making some scenes just not have the same impact as you imagined before. I recommend either a comic or audio for this. Both have their strengths and worth checking out. Some people were watching Contagion or Outbreak when COVID hit. I started reading this book. Technically, I didn't finish it yet, as of this writing. I'm about 150 pages left, which, given the size of this thing, it's not much left. If you want to know about the mechanics on how an outbreak like influenza can spread, how the medical field was changing rapidly, and the absolutely disgusting way vaccines used to be made, I recommend this book. This is a very large book. If you wanted to just know about the 1917 flu outbreak, there are other books to read. The first 100 pages alone are dedicated to the lives of the main doctors involved in the research of this epidemic and the origins of the Johns Hopkins Institute. There's one quote about the book that compares John Barry to Richard Preston, the author of The Hot Zone that turned into the movie Outbreak. And I'd say that's a good comparison. That's also not good. Preston tend to not lie, but write like a Tom Clancy wannabe thriller where he exaggerated some aspects about Ebola to get people invested in that book. And it wasn't to the point of lying, but it's something that should be taken note. Barry falls into those same trappings. It made for exciting reading, especially when your eyes start to glaze over another person's mini-biography in between the spreading of the flu. But in describing ways how this is nature having revenge on humanity, or walls being smeared with blood, or repeating certain phrases for dramatic effect, it almost kind of cheapens the more grounded, state the fact parts of the book. Nevertheless, I got what I paid for. I wanted a large book that talked about the flu epidemic. I got a large book that talked about the flu epidemic. I don't get personal on this channel, and I have no plans to do it. I will say, though, that I am most definitely the target audience of this book. Adult Children of Alcoholics is a short book from the 80s, written as an assessment of a study done in the 70s. I say that because while the terminology is absolutely incredibly dated, the basic info is still very solid at the common behaviors that manifest in people who've grown up in alcoholic households. It took about a third of the way through for me to say that what the book says applies to me, because the book goes through every type of behavior that can manifest from someone growing up in that environment, from the chaotic destructive to the inhibiting structured, and all in between. And because it covers so much and it's so short, I don't recommend this book if you're looking for answers. I recommend this book if you're looking for someone to say what you're feeling others have gone through. And for those out there who grew up feeling isolated because your upbringing was nowhere near like the others around you, that reassurance is such a good feeling to have, and it's a great stepping off point if you need help. Best I can describe Grady Hendrix is that he's like Ernest Cline, but good. Like Cline, Hendrix is very much a child of the 80s. His novel, My Best Friend's Exorcism, is a testament to that. Taking place in the 80s, it follows, well, two best friends, Abby and Gretchen, as they first met, and they go through high school together. Strange things start to happen that is testing their friendship, and with a title like My Best Friend's Exorcism, I didn't think I was going to be invested in the story the way I did. The story is played more like a mystery, but you do feel for these characters after the situation becomes more and more desperate, with a pretty bittersweet ending. Outside of the cursing, one creepy body horror scene, and a pretty hard bit of animal violence, I'd say this is a good young adult horror novel for those looking for that Stranger Things itch. But I think Hendrix's more time to shine was with this other book I read this year called Paperbacks from Hell. It's a nonfiction collection of 70s and 80s paperback horror novels, and while it has the size and look of your garden variety coffee table book you'd find in a reduced price section at a Barnes & Noble, Paperbacks is a good breakdown of how the publishing industry was changed and turned into as the decades rolled on. Each chapter breaks down the large variety of horror fiction with many punch-downs of the story tropes as a whole. I think the point of this book was to both make fun of the strange stories that were published at the time that makes anyone's middle school fanfiction look good, as well as showing off some forgotten gems. In fact, the popularity of this book had actually got some publishers to pick up the rights of some of these hidden gems that can now be more easily obtained. I say give a read, add some obscure horror to your forever growing to read list. I don't care if it's not a book. I'm not a gaming channel. I don't care. This was a fun game. You're a mom shark that gets killed and you play her kid and you eat and grow and you become a big shark, right? You gain evolutions like venom, electricity, and bone armor. You can ram boats. There's lots of nerdy references, and my favorite, you get to kill Moby Dick. One of the last bosses is literally Moby Dick. Good. That whale. I hate that book. It's a fun, turn off your brain game that has an ending that actually says more about the concept of revenge than a pulp novel I covered earlier this year. And that's it. What I read this year. Looking forward to another new year, and I know we all are. I left links to where you can buy these books below if you're interested, and let me know what you guys have been reading this year. I'll check them out and add my ever-growing to-be-read list. As always, take care.